There we go, right, okay. Well, welcome folks, thanks for joining us. This sunny evening, it is sunny in Edinburgh. Hope it's good where you are too. If this is your first time, warm welcome to you. If you've been with us before, well, welcome back. Just a couple of formalities as usual, just before we kick off. You do have a code of conduct. So if you're not familiar with it, great if you familiarise yourself with it. We do ask in short that you just be respectful to one another, simple as that. We'll do community shout-outs at the end. And in terms of the Q&A, we're going to keep it quite informal. It's quite a small group. Julian's quite keen to make it interactive and hope you'll all participate. We should have plenty of time for questions. He's got a short presentation. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Julian Stodd this evening as our guest speaker, a man of many talents. Julian's a writer and an artist, a researcher, consultant. I'm not sure if there's anything he doesn't do. He's got an extensive body of work, having written no less than 14 books. I'm currently enjoying this one. This is fabulous. Social Leadership Handbook. It's absolutely excellent. And Donald and I are also currently enjoying being two of cohort on his storytelling certification. I could wax lyrical all evening about Julian's work, but I won't. I'll hand over to him and let him take us through his insights on social age. Welcome, Julian. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction. I'm not quite sure I've earned it, but it's great to be here. I just sort of check if my audio is okay for everybody. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, you're good. Good.
Yeah, I need sort of thumbs up symbols. That's good. I was just sort of explaining to the others. I'm on holiday this week, so we're in Norfolk. And we're staying out in a caravan. We have an old family caravan up here, which is our only sort of post-lockdown holiday option. But we had a bit of a crisis today and got caught out, so I'm not where I was expecting to be. So I'm hooked onto some free Wi-Fi and in my car. So apologies if either I get towed or if the Wi-Fi goes dodgy. We should be okay. I've put together a space for us to explore more than anything, to talk about the context of the social age, to think about organizations and the evolution of organizations, perhaps from a leadership perspective and broader organizational transformation perspective. I am really quite keen to keep a space for conversation about it. So I know that these sessions are informal anyway, but I think we'll be fine to unmute microphones with a small group like this and just have a chat about it. So I've put some questions through the deck, as it were, as we go, but also you're very welcome just to kind of interrupt with a question or comment as we go. I can see the chat box, or you can just unmute or put your hand up and shout out. Will be fine as well. So I'm just going to bring up some slides and I'll set a context for us and talk through what we're going to do. So I've positioned this as a kind of welcome to the social age, and that's really the context I keep for all of my work, is to talk about the social age. And I'll start by exploring that a bit and kind of how it relates to the digital age more broadly. And then we'll tour through it to think about the social structure of organizations. So beyond the hierarchy, what does an organization look like, and how can we recognize and develop new models and types of leadership and operation. I'll start with a couple of caveats, if I may. So this illustration is from a book which I'm working on at the moment about learning science, actually. So it's about the sort of cognitive aspects of how we learn. So it's not directly relevant to what we're talking about today, which will give you an indication of how this session is going to go. But I've put it in here because I guess partly because I'm claiming a permission to use this session as a learning session as well. I could have brought you a sort of beautifully polished body of work and presented it, but that would have been pretty tedious and to be honest, you can read it or find it elsewhere. So instead, I'm focusing on this, a question of how we develop our sense of understanding about how the world works, which really limits or constrains or enables us to conceive of what the world could be like. Now, in this instance, I think we're thinking about the future of work. What could the future of work look like? What will our future organizations look like? What will leadership look like? And our sort of incoming hypothesis is this. Firstly, we're all brilliant. There's clearly no doubt about that. So we kind of all know what we're doing. We're all carrying various years of experience. And we know what to do at a sort of tactical, skills, operational level. But we also know what to do because we're held within a sort of cognitive frame of understanding. So in my own work recently, I've been trying to focus on those two things. Firstly, how we know the things we know. And secondly, to understand the container that knowledge sits within. And even people like Barry, who've heard me talking about this stuff before, might sort of recognize an evolution in this language, because the container is quite often invisible to us. The context of our understanding is often invisible. So we end up pontificating from a place of understanding. And you only have to go to Twitter or LinkedIn or much of the media to see very easy and convenient narratives of what the future will look like. You know, everyone's got an answer for it. Everyone's bringing in the right buzzwords, and I'll apologize if I do some of that as well, because of course we're all constrained by this context of understanding that we have. So the point of this slide is this: learning, as with any form of change, and learning is generally about change, involves breaking ourselves in some way. We have to break the way that we understand something. We have to sort of fracture an existing framework. And then sometimes we just reject the new thing. You know, you may listen to what I'm saying today and say, well, it's all very interesting, but frankly, you don't believe any of it. And you could simply reject it all. Or you may say, well, I might not have agreed with the exact words, but it has in some way cracked or opened up a space in which I'm going to do my own thinking. So learning, you know, or interaction can sometimes give us that space of operation. And of course, sometimes we have these moments where the frame completely fractures. You know, we sort of see the world in a new way. And I guess ultimately that's almost what we try to do with our formal education systems. We give people a ton of knowledge and stuff, but what we're really looking to do is to enable us to really take a step sideways and look in on a situation with a different light. I mean, I normally say that I don't think I took anything out of university except the ability to sort of look at something from a different direction. So all of us, I guess, as we are engaging with other people, as we're learning, we're sort of breaking ourselves, sometimes willingly, or sometimes that pain is imposed upon us by a requirement of an organization or a project or a system. So the process of being broken can be either willing, you know, you choose you want to learn to play the guitar better, or you want to become a better artist, or unwilling but necessary. You know, we have to do something in order to survive. But then when we reconcile ourselves, so in the underlying sort of science of learning, we would look both at how you break yourself, but also how you reconcile yourself. So all of us here may be sort of sat here thinking, there are some things I'm sure I don't know, but we're probably not sat here thinking, I'm completely adrift. I've got no conception of how to understand things. You know, we've got a complete grasp of how it is. So we pull those fractured pieces together into a new mosaic. And I'm sort of using this language of a mosaic because the idea is that we may all take the same pieces, the same tiles, but build a different mosaic. And when we look at socially constructed knowledge, or the views of a group or a community or a society or an organization, they're typically not monocultural. They may believe that they are. We may believe that everybody believes the same thing, but actually, and I guess ultimately always our understanding of a thing is our own mosaic. So it may well be a picture of a strange donkey. We may all have that same picture, but it's always a little bit different for each of us. And this is quite important, because if we understand the ways that we introduce disturbance, the ways that we make sense of new knowledge, the ways that we conceive the new, but also the lack of conformity in what our belief of that is, then we can probably bring a useful lens to bear at times like this, when we're talking about the evolution of organizations, the evolution of leadership, the new normal or the lack of new normal, or whatever the new normal is. There's a great deal of uncertainty, some of which relates directly to our knowledge, and another part of which relates to our frame of understanding. I'll sort of pause there and try to rephrase that in a slightly different way. So I taught a class at the Berlin School of Creative Leadership a couple of years ago, and so a lot of people from creative industries go there, and one of them reached out today saying, quoting some work in an architectural journal, saying, as we've moved from the office to home, we've lost something because the home is not a creative space. And of course, what they mean is, in their work, in their experience of a home, their home has not been a creative space. There is nothing innate about a home which is not creative. And for me, it highlights one of the traps we easily fall into as we look at a new situation, is we carry across that container, that frame from the old world into the new. So it may well be that in the old world, people found the office was a creative space and home was not a creative space. But if the frame is fractured, if the context of work has shifted, if we are now distributed together but somehow apart, then there's no limit to what the home could become. Because of course, home is a social construct that is woven through the bricks and mortar that make the building that you're sat within. So the building itself you can measure in terms of bricks and centimeters and millimeters and tons, but the notion of home is something which is socially constructed. So most of the facets of our society that form the dominant aspects of our container, our frame, are socially constructed and relate to physical construction as well. So we have offices and libraries and universities and churches and parliament buildings. And then we have structures of power and control that sit within those, but all of it is made up. It's all fictional. The types of organizations that we all work in today, in financial services, in healthcare, in education, in technology, it's all made up. And almost the biggest challenge we face as we move into a new domain is that old understanding of how things were, which leads people to talk about the move from office to distributed as if we're losing something, rather than recognizing we're just laying the foundations for something new. I'm just going to bring another slide. I've got one or two more slides in the question, but again, I'll remind you of the importance of interrupting or asking a question or joining in. I'll tell you why. It's because I'm wrong about this more often than I'm right about it. I'd sort of phrase it like this. I generally, of course, I think I'm right. You know, I'm pretty sure we all think we're right most of the time. I've kind of peered into the darkness. I've seen a few sparks flying around, and I've assumed I can see the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You know, so generally, I think I've got a view of where we're going. But if you looked at that specifically, it's probably wrong, or it might be wrong in your context when it's right in my context. And this, is, again, probably speaks to something of our general challenge of understanding, or to put it another way, why a big consulting company is never going to sell you the answer. Because they may be generally right, You know, it's not that hard to spot trends or do research and discover something, but specifically it's unlikely to be right for you. Or as a more general point, the concrete, tactical, operational level of our understanding and activity is probably something we will have to win and earn and construct ourselves and within communities such as this, rather than something we will pick up wholesale from somebody else. Most of what we will need to do will need to be contextualized to our local understanding. So just sort of finally in this space, I've talked about the social age, and this is of course, again, like much of my work, this is a bit of an abstraction. It's actually one of the oldest illustrations that I still use, because I'm trying to illustrate this point. We of course didn't go entirely from sort of industrial into knowledge, into digital, into social. But a city like Edinburgh, and I know not all of you are in Edinburgh, but is a good example, as many of our older cities are, where we see many of the older spaces that have been repurposed as we have moved. So factories repurposed into offices, into houses, into loft living, into dodgy nightclubs, into derelict areas and car parks. We see how the physical infrastructure of the city always casts a shadow into the past. In fact, next Thursday, I think I'm publishing a new guidebook. So it's a short book on the socially dynamic organization. And I struggled for a bit with the introduction to that. And eventually I illustrated it before I wrote the chapter on. I illustrated a sort of a tower of a modern building with this vast shadow cast back. And that was to remind myself that our organizations, which are often excellent, are a monument to the things that they used to be good at. Organizations accrete system and process and hierarchy and mass and expertise, all of which is superbly optimized for the early part of today and most of yesterday and a great deal of all the years that came before. But almost certainly, the further forward you look, the more sub-optimized it is, which is fairly obvious, I guess. But the challenge is we don't have very many effective mechanisms in organizations for deconstructing ourselves. If you remember, I said learning is about disruption and fracturing and rebuilding. Well, organizations are lousy at doing that. You know, they do it through big industrial solutions where they cut people and change people and try to take programmatic approaches. But at heart, the message is this. In some way, and you could draw this to look completely different if you wanted to, but in my understanding, as we've moved especially from sort of knowledge into the digital age and the social age, we've been encumbered with ever more layers of the things that came before. And if I just try to indicate two key differences between the digital and the social age, and I should say these are really concurrent, we're clearly in the midst of the digital age, but also in the emergence of the social age. So the first feature that we see is radical connectivity. And, you know, this session today is an example of this. We are connected today in many different ways, almost all of which are beyond the oversight or control of any organization, or indeed government or law enforcement agency. In fact, in my work in Scotland, in the National Health Service in Scotland, I did a large piece of research with around 5,000 people in late 2018. People described that on average, they believed they were a member of at least 15 different communities that helped them to be effective on a daily basis. So it wasn't like an old Blue Peter badge lodged in a box in the attic. These are the communities they believed helped them to be effective on a daily basis. So radical connectivity is a core feature of the social age. And the second thing is the democratization of technology. So the other interesting thing with that group was that they believed in total, they identified 17 different technologies that they used to collaborate to be effective on a daily basis, 16 of which they were explicitly forbidden from using. So 16 of the 17 in some way they were excluded from using because of privacy or data protection, fears to share any kind of patient data or any sensitive information, and yet they're the ones they use. And we see that time and again. So when I prototyped that research actually with the Joint Special Forces Operations University in the US, we identified the #1 technology they used to collaborate to solve intractable engineering problems was WhatsApp. And of course they do that for very clearly articulated reasons, because you can pull together a group of people that you trust, you can curate the problem, you can solve the problem, and you can disband the group and nobody would ever know it existed. Now, is that right? Well, it depends what you define by right. Legally, it may be wrong. According to rules, it may be wrong. But in terms of being effective, it may be right. So we're clearly seeing a great deal of permeability and crossover. The move into a dispersed social mode of operation is about far more than simply geography. So let me sort of pause and throw you a question. I'll throw you this question, but you can also comment on anything we've seen so far. This group, are you a community? I don't know what the mechanism is for unmuting people. You may have to request it.
Yeah, folk can unmute themselves, Julian.
There you go.
Restricted that, so that's me just done it now. I've also put a wee message in the chat, so if folk are more comfortable just putting their thoughts into the chat, I'll relay them back to you. Richard said meet regularly.
Yeah.
I would say that's what attracted me to this, because I felt it was a community.
Excellent.
Or it is.
Well, fantastic.
Oh, some stuff coming through now. Roddy says shared interests. Richard said core members and leadership. Anna says the moment I start recognizing people and get greeted, becomes a community. Daryl says I would love to think we are. Indeed, says the co-organizer. Indy says values I feel I can align to. That's a nice one. And Craig, we meet weekly and we used to have evening meetings and lunchtime meetings too. Yeah, I mean, we do have a number of members of our community who join our sessions. We've been doing weekly sessions since the outset of the lockdown, so that's been since pretty much the start of April. We had to shift our March meetup, which was due to be a face-to-face, which was a bi-monthly at that time, to a remote event, and then the rest of Donald and I shifted to a weekly cadence of remote sessions. We were able to have community members from all over the world, so it's a growing community, and other meetups have experienced something similar, for sure.
So there's a good few things to sort of pick up on in that. I note those of you who are shy and those of you who are not. So if text is going to be our preferred medium of the evening, I will adjust the delivery accordingly. But do feel free to be brave and speak out. Whilst you're girding your loins and thinking about doing so, I'll just comment on a few of those things. The first thing I have to ask, I guess, is, am I in your community? So am I a member of your community?
I would like to think so. I hope you would like to be. You'd be welcome.
Well,
you are welcome.
Again, I would say you are. One of the things we do is invite all our guest speakers to join us. Everybody's got something to contribute, whether it's just at this moment in time or it's in the future. And we hope this will be an ongoing conversation.
So unsurprisingly, the initial responses here from the community leaders, I would note, are that I'm very welcome. So that's nice. I feel good about that. Anybody else have a view? Am I, right now, this minute, am I a member of your community? Because you don't know what my values are. So, you know, values that people feel, you've not tested my values. So I've not passed a membership test. You don't know me, I've not turned up regularly.
I think it's probably slightly different for Donald and I, because we've been engaging with your work and we're keen for you to come and speak at one of our events, because we felt that your body of work aligned very closely to sorts of things that we as a community are interested in.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the association clearly is.
Which is, you know, so personally that makes me feel good, and what the research tells me as well. So I took that group of NHS professionals in Scotland, and I asked them to look at all of their communities, and remember, on average, they said they were a member of 15, and I asked them to identify the top community, the number one community that they felt gave them most value. And I asked them some questions about that community. The first question I asked them was, how did you find that community? And they generally said, I didn't find it. It found me. So reputation, you know, maybe you found me, that's actually very typical. That's how people describe that they find some of their most valuable communities, is they are actually invited in. And in fact, that's what I would have heard from that military group. They established a WhatsApp group and they invited people in at a first degree of trust. So trust, I see, has already come up here. And also, we're willing to sponsor it out to second degrees. So Donald and Sath may well know me in some way, and the rest of you are kind of trusting them to trust me. So already we're operating further than one degree of trust. So again, if I go back to that group in the research and say, well, that's nice. So you were invited into a community, but what was the sort of single most important thing that has led to your ongoing success within the community? So is it, you know, because people are brilliant? Is it because you get a cool badge and a t-shirt? What's the thing that keeps you in a community? And if I pushed them to say what was the most important thing, they said the choreography of welcome and engagement was the most important thing. The way that they were welcomed to the community had the longest lasting legacy. So in some ways, it's really obvious, isn't it? You know, if we join a community and we feel that swell of good stuff, which you're all nicely expressing in the chat room, then we probably are more likely to stay. If we join a community and everyone's miserable and grumpy and really intelligent, we might not stay. You know, there's sort of less of an incentive to stay, I guess, depending on the type of community that it is. If everybody's miserable and grumpy but can help you make loads of money, maybe you'll hang around, I don't know. Or maybe we won't. Or maybe we'll turn up, but we won't be a member. So maybe I can just turn up, but not be a member. What if membership is different from participation? So I could ask you that question. Could I be here today, right now, but not be a member of your community? So does anybody think I am not a member of your community right now, this minute, because I'm here?
Probably me. I probably feel I'm not a member of the community yet.
Okay. Say a little more about that.
So I'm trying this out because it looked very interesting, and I've loved watching the comments and different things. So I thought I'm making up. When I saw your book cover, I just was instantly drawn to it. I thought, right, I like what the cover's trying to tell me, so I thought this would be a really good one to start with.
Well, that's kind. When I wrote that book, I eagerly awaited, 10 minutes after launch, the first Amazon review to come in. 3 weeks later, when the first Amazon review came in, it said, I like the pictures. Made me happy. Made all that effort on the words worthwhile.
I thought the pictures were good, but it's not just that. It's like the title, social leadership. That intrigued me because I do a lot of work with leaders and things, so it's quite interesting. So I'm very interested to learn more.
Well, that's kind. Thank you. I will take us into that subject, I promise. But let's just. Sorry, I'm always terrible with names and on Zoom.
So just can I pick up on a point there, Julian? I thought
you
mentioned, which I thought was quite interesting. So you talked there about community versus membership, and obviously we're working through your certification. I've nearly finished your book, so we've had different sort of numbers each week. A number of regulars, people have been brilliant at contributing, participating, engaging, but we have a membership of 1,179. I've got a separate screen here that you can't see, so I'll turn my head. I'll look at another screen. So that's our membership. So you said something that quite intrigued me there, the notion of community versus membership. So
well, yes,
I'd be quite keen to hear a little bit more about your kind of thoughts on that.
Well, in some ways, I'd be quite keen to hear your thoughts on that, because because the point is that I carried out some large-scale research around trust 3 or 4 years ago, and it was very annoying because at the start of that work, I knew exactly what trust was. And by the time I'd finished asking people about trust, I realized that we all know what trust is, and virtually none of us agree on what it is. It's a social construct, and it's subjective. And if you ask people to describe it, they have no hesitation in doing so, but they almost all use different words and indeed different frameworks to understand it. And most of those words they use are also subjective, which becomes very annoying because you get subjectivity described by subjectivity, which is a notion of nested subjectivity, which is another way of saying it's a house of cards. It's the social world is annoying. The physical world you can describe in terms of kilograms and sheer strength and so on, and you can describe it through physics and science, which is great. The social world is highly subjective. So when we talk about community and membership and belonging, the interesting thing is we may all have a different understanding. So I'm here, unsure if I'm in this community or not. Some people apparently have signed up to a mailing list, so they're members of the community. Some people are kind of testing it out and hanging about, so they're a member, they're here today, and maybe we'll be here, but we're kind of sizing it up and seeing. And of course, this is the nature of almost anything. When you look at it through a microscope, you discover it's more complex than we initially thought. And if we relate that to some of the ideas coming out in the chat here, we can see a few things. Let me pick up on a few things. So Greg said, behaving politely is a good start. Quite right. So if I want to be accepted into this community, then I'm likely to continue behaving politely. But imagine I start being really misogynistic and I start sort of dismissing you or using some objectionable language. Now, maybe I don't make it so objectionable that you just all hang up on the spot, but it's objectionable enough that something inside you is going to click and say, this person is an outsider. So we can generally all recognize that sense of it. When we're interacting with someone, we actually do it very fast. We make these assumptions of this is somebody I could invest belief in. This is somebody I could trust. This is somebody that could belong. Or we actually make the opposite decision very fast as well. So we're all expert. We're clearly all highly functional social individuals smiling away on our webcams. So we may continue to nod and smile, but something inside us has said, I wouldn't trust this person with £20, or perhaps more importantly, I wouldn't introduce this person to someone else in my network because I just don't really think they're the right kind of person. They don't have the same values. Now, that's interesting for all sorts of reasons, because we could start to tease out a taxonomy of membership. I'll try to describe how I see it. But again, remember I said at the start, this may be generally right, but it's probably specifically wrong. So as a result of the trust research, I evolved my own language around social structures to describe individuals belonging to tribes and then communities existing above that. So I would see a tribe as a trust bonded unit. So I can't just join your tribe by turning up because you may not trust me yet. I say may not because some people actually do tend to trust immediately based on context. But we clearly have multiple structures to which we belong that we trust. So, for example, your friends are probably a group that you trust. Your family is probably a group that you trust. You probably have a group of people around you in your everyday work that you trust. But a community, which is another type of social structure, is meta-tribal. So there may be people within a community that you don't trust, but you do still belong to that community. But typically people describe there is one form of attraction, if you like, or magnetism, which is quite strong, and I'll just call that trust bonded for the sake of a better word. But there are also other types of social connections, which are looser or more variable or more pragmatic or more contextual. And maybe communities can be meta-tribal. So by coincidence, some communities may entirely map onto one tribe. So, you know, you may be in a small team at work and you trust everybody in that team. So hence it is one tribe and one community and indeed one team, which is a formally defined structure. But equally, you could turn up to work and not really trust anybody that you work with. So in the landscape of trust research, 54% of people globally said they have low or no trust in the organization that they work for. But they all still turn up and work. And that's quite interesting. So I'll just try to draw this down a bit. But what it may mean is that our old organizations were largely structures of contractual bonds. You know, you join an organization, you sign a contract, you get shown your place. Quite literally, you get shown your place in the office and you get shown your place in the hierarchy and structure. However, at the same time, you join something else entirely. You join tribes, communities, teams. We join an organization most likely in all sorts of different ways. Because of course, some people can be members even if you don't want them to be a member. So because you've put no formal mechanism of membership in place, I could be misogynistic and hence excluded socially, but I could still believe that I'm a member. If membership is something that I can claim, which it kind of is because you've not put any formal mandate in place. So I find it interesting to consider this because as we move into the social age, as we're more interconnected, as the technology is democratized, and as our organizations become increasingly virtual, to understand what people actually belong to may be extremely significant.
It's quite a lot of good stuff coming through in the chat. So
yeah, let me catch up with that.
Yes, so really just sort of the audience's own ideas around what the criteria might be or what constitutes a sort of community. The thing I was just thinking there while you were sort of articulating that was, it's obviously not as simple as this, but in my head it feels like one of the distinctions between a community and membership is it as simple as those who are active versus those who are passive? So you're slightly familiar with one of my work examples that I used, I think it was maybe last week or the week before on your program, just as an example of a community that I'm involved in trying to mobilize. And we actually have dashboarded metrics within the platform, and one of the things it reports on is active versus passive participants. and it has an algorithm, obviously, for how it categorizes those two different groups. Is that part of it?
Well, what it probably relates to is that there of course it just gets more complex because there are many different types of communities we belong to, some of which we may talk a lot in, others of which we may never talk in at all. But as per some of the comments here, we may absolutely feel we belong. We may find huge value in the conversation, but we don't feel that we add into it. And similarly, there are many different roles that we take within a community. Some people are very vocal, some people will lead, some people will organize, some people will bring knowledge, some people will bring empathy and support in tiny ways to one other member entirely out of your sight, weaving together the social fabric of the organization, but you never hear them or see them or think about them. But they do it privately through side channels, stitching the whole piece together. Some communities are subscription communities. We kind of pay our fees and subscribe to them and have clearly defined membership, whilst other communities are communities of intent or purpose. In my own work, I've evolved my definition of community. So I used to say in the Social Leadership Handbook, it still says, I forget what chapter it is, it would be chapter 4 or so, or maybe chapter 5. It says a community is an entity of shared purpose and shared values, which felt right. But I now realize it's almost entirely wrong. Some communities are entities of shared value and shared purpose. But the only definition I use now is that universally, a community is an entity of exclusion. A community can almost, by definition, only be a community if somebody isn't in it. If everybody in the world is sort of all together, then it's not really a community. So some people may be excluded because they don't have access to technology, because they haven't heard what we say, because they hold different views from us, but, because they're prevented from being here, maybe for good reasons. Maybe they're caring for somebody in their family. Maybe they've got children who need feeding at this time and hence can't participate on the calls, so hence would be seen as silent and never get the chance to form those social connections. We can be excluded for all sorts of ways. There's a question here: who defines the boundary of a community? Well, that's one of the few questions I'll be able to give you a sort of a slightly concrete answer to, only in terms of broadly you can see two types of communities, one of which is open and one of which is gated. And a gated community is typically a community where the barrier to entry is very high and typically experiential. But once you're inside, there tends to be a very low barrier or friction of communication. So let me give you an example. There could be a community of women who have been victims of sexual violence, and there is a very clearly defined boundary of that community, and quite clearly I can never be a part of that community. And so gated communities are quite interesting. Sometimes they can be gated through that kind of experience. Sometimes they can be gated by social class or gender. And of course, sometimes they can be gated financially because you have to pay, large amounts of money. So they gated communities are most certainly exclusive, not necessarily in a bad way, but they do exclude people. So the thing I would say is this. I'll just comment on Roddy, your point. In the past, I did a town planning degree, and communities were largely defined as physical, e.g. a district, neighbourhood, or down to a street, which I like. That's interesting, although I wouldn't agree with it. And if any of you have been down to I live in Dorset, and you may know Poundbury in Dorset is quite interesting. It's like a much classier version of Milton Keynes, where Barry lives. Poundbury is the Prince of Wales his model village. It's a space which has been built sort of counter to many of the sort of town planning guidelines. So it's kind of built to be old. It's interesting for a number of reasons. There are no street markings. There are no double yellow lines. In many places, there's not much differentiation between pavement and road. The pathways are engineered so they don't always follow the roads. And the idea is everybody is just kind of kind and considerate and hopefully doesn't park in the wrong place or run anybody down. And it's also built with a lot of the social housing mixed in with the other types of housing and industry indeed. Now it's interesting because you can absolutely create architecture, but it doesn't necessarily make a community until two people come together and complain about the fact that the pavements are weird. It's the people coming together which make a community. And quite often people come together in opposition to something formal rather than because of it. So you can very easily lay down the roads and houses and not build a community, very much in the same way that organizations right now are doing their best to lay down the foundations of technology in the belief that they will get social connectivity or community or collaboration. But of course they don't, because these things are typically traded in social currencies and take place beyond the formal realm or between the formal and social realms. So, yeah, we spent quite a bit of time on community. Let me just sort of edge us in. Let me just see where I just have to remind myself where we're going next. So just give me a moment to do that. Yeah, okay. I'll just show you a couple of bits, actually. One piece, because it's from Scotland, so I want to sort of bring that in. I'd say, I might come back to this question. I'll just share the context of my work is this, the formal organization, the formal structure is the thing that employs you. So the hierarchy of the organization, your contract gives you a place within that hierarchy. On the one side, we have that, and on the other, we have the social structure. I've only drawn one here, but of course, there are many concurrent overlapping social structures. So an organization has one formal structure and multiple overlapping social structures. And I used to say that the social structure flows through and around the formal structure, but I largely think that is now wrong. I think that the social structure flows into the formal structure and nests there and builds an empire and will fight you to the death to prevent you taking it away, which is why, of course, our formal organizations become constrained in times of change. But there's a tension between these. There's a tension between these systems. Formal systems are generally very good at bringing people together to be effective at scale and controlling them, in a good way to get consistency, conformity, replicability, and scale. Social structures are generally very good at subverting the formal, at being creative and innovative, but often at quite a local level. So tacit tribal knowledge sits within this social structure, formal codified knowledge sits within the formal structure, and the two aren't reconciled. But it's interesting to understand this dynamic tension between the two. It's probably a tension that we actively need. So the formal structure is held together by bonds of power. When you sign your contract, you are positioned within this pyramid of power, the people that you can apply consequence onto and the people who can apply consequence onto you. But the social structure is bonded, bonds of trust. Trust is one of the forces, but by no means the only one. Pride, respect, gratitude, kindness, empathy, a multitude of social forces hold together multiple concurrent social structures. This is the social structure as represented by the medics in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. So there's a parallel diagram to this where they connect themselves by job role, but this shows how Joanne and Dave are connected by Guinness and rugby, by insight, by kindness, by cake, by reassurance, courage, inspiration. These are just messy, convoluted diagrams. But what these represent is the real world. You know, this is the way that we really are. Some of that stuff you were talking about earlier, spending time together by talking about rugby, if you happen to enjoy rugby, by being kind to people, by the sharing of cake. Exactly, you know, Rod is exactly right. Sharing cake is one of the mechanisms people almost universally describe as they describe how trust is forged over experiences and kindness. So highly subjective, also highly exclusive, of course. So the reality is that I am more likely to connect with people who are kind and like me and seem like me and sound like me and even look like me. You know, this is why our communities grow. If we don't actively do anything about it, they tend to grow in very predictable and replicable ways. So the exclusion becomes baked into the system.
Like that.
I guess actually I will just let's just talk about this for a minute. So I'm not normally I would ask you how you know you belong to your formal organization. In fact, let me do that. I think if you are employed at the moment, this will be most relevant for you. If you're not, then maybe just think about your last employed role. How do you know that you belong to that organization? How do you actually know that you've got a job?
Got an employee ID.
You've got an employee ID, absolutely. You get paid,
Yeah,
absolutely. Pretty good sign generally that things are going well. Yeah, salary slip, you know, get paid, paycheck. All focusing on the money. Yeah. pretty good. You should always keep your eye on the money. You agree to a contract. Yeah. You have a contract. So a contract, you know, most of you will have signed a contract. Yeah. Contract tells you where you sit within the system, tells you what you're in charge of, what you can do, tells you how much you'll be paid, of course. You get your security ID and you get past the security barrier. So almost immediately we start talking about artifacts and rituals and power. So your badge is totemic. So your badge is not just a bit of plastic. It represents something. It represents that you belong. And indeed, if you say something misogynistic and get fired, your badge will be taken away from you. So organizations which like to believe that they are kind of very logical formal structures rely almost entirely on artifacts and rituals and aspects of belief to exist. Yeah, your login works, absolutely. Technology works. So membership of an organization or belonging to an organization can absolutely be described in these kind of terms. You have the right artifacts, you've been given the right sort of things, including a desk. I noticed went past there. You know, it's a good artifact, isn't it? You know, if you turn up for work one day and your desk's been taken away or your login doesn't work, it's an indication that things are not going to go well that day. So that's one of the mechanisms by which organizations exert control. Is through the control of those physical things. And as you get promoted, you know, you get a bigger desk and you get a better computer and you get a parking space. So power sits within that network quite nicely. The rituals are very important. You know, the rituals of even of preparing for meetings, and many organizations are heavily constrained by rituals that become rituals of rehearsal. So they get trapped in loops where any formal information that flows through the organization gets rehearsed and codified to a point of abstraction. You know, they end up with these monstrous documents and decks that all look the same and are branded by an internal comms team, but are utterly meaningless. You know, they don't carry meaning within themselves. They are just totemic of power. Scott got a good point there. Don't think enough badges have been taken away for misogyny. Yes, sure that you will not be alone in thinking that. So belonging, I know it might sound sort of odd if we're talking about work, why we talk about belonging, you know, just take the money and turn up and do the thing. It takes us into the realm of social science, you know, it all becomes a bit soft and squishy, except that organizations want more. So most of us are paid for our time, but what the organization really wants is something additional. In fact, most of what organizations currently say they want is investment of something. They want your generosity, they want your connections, they want your brilliance, they want your cumulative potential. They want all sorts of things which go beyond pure time. And so there's a real imperative for organizations to nurture high functioning and interconnected social communities. And yet, social communities do not belong to an organization. And this is a real challenge. I think many organizations believe the right things and want to do the right things, and indeed start doing the right things. And then they stub their toe on reality and fall over themselves to impose control upon the system or to own the outputs from a system. But it's interesting, in the landscape of trust research, people described how they trust formal technology about 30% less than they trust social technology. So if we were having this meeting on an instance of Teams that was owned by your organization, you would probably use quantifiably different words and share different things than if we use it on a private Zoom channel. I'm sorry, I hope your toe is feeling better. we've all done that. So let me just go back to this question from Liz. Is that why social interactions evolve? Liz, what was your question about there? Sorry if I've missed that in the chat.
So when you were talking about almost like the rituals, so everyone gets involved in rituals all the time, and is that why the social interactions start, because the rituals almost become too much?
Yeah.
Too constraining?
Yeah. So they evolve to the point where they become exclusive. You know, when I said earlier, communities become entities of exclusion, it's another way of saying communities become incredibly valuable and highly cohesive internally. So if the 17 of us spend this time together and find real value together, and you know, and form this incredibly tight community where, you know, we all talk about stubbing our toes and recognize it's an in-joke because we've, you know, all done that before, then we become exclusive to new people who've not got a clue what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So me joking with Barry about Milton Keynes is meaningless to the rest of you, because I'm referencing virtually every time Barry's on a call with me, I make a joke about Milton Keynes. But you wouldn't know that. I'm excluding you by my language and action. So the interesting thing, the power is in understanding this. It's easy for organizations to believe that they're logical and the social system is illogical, or that the formal world is where the value lies and the social world is full of idiots like me talking about soft and fluffy stuff. But in fact, the formal organization is built around ritual and about totems and icons, is built exactly the same as everything else, as is the social world. So many of you right now are wearing items of clothing or pieces of jewelry, or you have pictures on your wall that are meaningful to you because they have been gifted to you, because they represent something, because they are totemic. Our houses are full of objects which are socially imbued. I could not walk into any of your houses and understand the meaning of those things. And it's much the same with organizations, that there is nothing about their culture which sits within the molecules of the carpet or the kind of coffee that they buy. It exists within patterns of social behavior and rituals which are shared and replicated over time. Logically, all organizations should be the same because they're all full of the same kinds of people, but they're not. Organizations are different. Some are good and some are really dreadful. because the rituals and communities and membership and social structures permeate through and persist over time. And as new members join, they have to conform. So my price of membership to this community is to conform. If I really want to be a member, I have to conform to something. So you've already led with the fact there's a code of conduct, so I'd better start by conforming to that. But I will also, if I hang out in here for any length of time, I will start to conform in all sorts of other ways. I'll even start probably to conform in the things that I believe in as well, or at least the things I tell you I believe in. So social structures are inherently dominated by forces of conformity, which is great because it bonds them together, but bad because, of course, in almost any example of toxic culture or behavior, it's the conformity that stops people speaking out and driving change. This is one way of looking at organizational culture if you try to actually put a structure around it. People, this is an incomplete picture, but people describe two things very clearly. When they join an organization, they sign that contract, they go in, they describe clearly how they meet some people, and some of those people they like, and some of those people they come to trust. And in a matter of hours into days, they form what's called a primary cultural alignment. They belong to the organization legally and contractually, and they have a primary cultural alignment, which is typically hyperlocal and held with people. Then there's a secondary thing that occurs. So some people become highly effective. They sort of manage to exert this geopolitical power. They manage to be effective at scale and build social movements for change. But that secondary cultural alignment, people say, normally takes 3 to 5 years to build. And crucially, if you have it and I don't, I can't get it from you just by asking questions. You could spend a year telling me everything you know about everybody else in the organization, and I could go and speak to those people and they'd say, but you're not Sath. So why would I work with you in that way? Why would I trust you in that way? It's almost certainly experiential, and probably most people never get there because we find our belonging in that primary cultural alignment. And once we belong and we're getting our paycheck, we've kind of got all bases covered. So I belong to the thing that mandates what I do, takes my time and gives me money. And I belong to the community that makes me feel good and safe and shares my values. They just don't happen to be the same thing. So it's interesting to understand that, because of course, when organizations try to change, they typically do so by changing the formal structure, which is fine and doesn't really matter because we don't live in the formal structure. We live in the social structure. We live in our local tribes and communities. Okay. So, so if we think about this, the social organization, by what mechanisms are people excluded?
By going for lunch together. Certain people go and some people don't get asked.
Yeah. So that tribal nature can exclude.
Geography would be one for me. I think I mentioned this last week, so in the comments. I mean, this fact that we can do this remotely is awesome for me, but after lockdown, if you guys went back to face-to-face and cancelled the remotes, that would be a loss for me. And I would probably feel less part of the community, given that it'd be, for me to engage would be like a 6-hour drive or something. So geography is one.
Yeah, definitely. Good point. So you said, Julian, you yourself earlier touched on exclusion. You talked about language. So I find that one quite curious, how language itself can leave people excluded.
Well, language can exclude in a number of different ways. So the first way that it can exclude is that codified expertise tends to build jargon and patterns of language around things. So we use that to exclude people. But also it carries a totemic value. So I think a number of you work around sort of agile methodologies, so you'll probably recognize both aspects of that. The first is you can look down and scorn the people who don't understand all the different development methodologies and language. But secondly, all the annoying people in your organization that now make artisanal, organic, agile projects, they haven't got a clue what they're talking about. So, language can absolutely run alongside power. Language can carry power, but it can also carry violence. So again, a couple of you may have heard me talk about this before, but let's say I'm talking about this session afterwards, and I say it was really great. There were all sorts of fantastic people on that call, and then Liz came up with a question. I really like Liz. She's really quirky. Now, by doing so, I'm using a violent language. I'm effectively putting somebody firmly within a space. Say they're really likable, I enjoyed it, but of course they're a bit oddball. So our language carries a violence within it, even sometimes, of course, or indeed often unintentionally. It's worth remembering that the violence of language in organizations is typically carried by largely good people doing largely good things. And yet the broader frameworks that they perpetuate are often deeply rooted in language. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in that at the moment. I don't think you're quirky, Liz. I apologise for using it.
It's all right, that would be a compliment, it's fine.
Okay, let's and let me just check in on time here. So, okay,
you've got about 20 minutes. So.
Okay, we'll make sure we finish really promptly, because I know it's it's the evening. It's things. I'm just gonna jump ahead. I just want to sort of think a little bit about this, and I'll tell you why. If we just elevate ourselves up, I guess, because the group is called The Future of Work, so I feel we should pay some homage to the future of work. This is just a playful reflection on not really just the future of work, but the future of sort of structures of society. And I'll use a few examples. Society is organized in very predictable ways. So we have nations, which are largely defined by geography. We have organizations, which are distinguished by productivity and purpose and effect. We have organized religions, which are entities of codified belief. We have government, which are systems of state-sanctioned power and violence through police and military. We have universities and schools, which are structured mechanisms of education, both the codification of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. So the structures of society are generally pretty clear, but worth remembering that they're also entirely made up. You can't, they're not governed by forces of nature. Someone earlier even referenced Dunbar's number, which is interesting because, Dunbar's number was right in the context of its time, but is quite probably also changing in the context of radical interconnectivity. So there are people who work, actually. There's I made a right idiot of myself the other day when I working with one of the big tech companies, and I'm on a panel, and that they invited on Jeffrey West, who's a quantum physicist who's sort of shifted into biology, and he's written a superb book about scale, the underlying rules that govern the scale of social structures and organizations. And when I realized I was on a call with him, I was like, oh my God, you're amazing. I think you're absolutely brilliant. And, made a right fool of myself, which is why you should never meet your heroes. It's always worth remembering that. But what if the structures of our organization are becoming outdated? Well, clearly, we're seeing the evolution of organizations, the emergence of the transnationals and the metanationals, organizations which do have a footprint in a country, but often are only loosely connected by taxation or loosely connected by IP, and of course are larger than some countries, or indeed many countries. So the transnationals become significantly entities of belief more than anything else. The notion of nation was really governed by a legacy of communication technology and transport technology, when, you know, a mountain range formed a border, or a river or a lake formed a border. So when Theresa May said, you know, if you say you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere, she's almost entirely wrong. You can be both a citizen of the world and a citizen of the UK, and quite probably a citizen of Scotland, and almost certainly a citizen of Apple, and probably a citizen of Google, if you so wish to be, because the notion of citizenship itself is changing. You know, the infrastructure for taxation and security was the historic triangle of a country. You know, we will keep you safe, we will tax you, and we will give you infrastructure. But when governments cease to keep people safe because they become increasingly partisan in nature, and when infrastructure is substantially provided by Netflix and Google on a subscription basis rather than a taxation basis, well, you know, you say subscription, I say taxation. It's all much the same thing. You pay something, you get some utility. It just no longer happens to be a government. And indeed, as we see with much of the current crisis around information and truth, who is the arbiter going to be? Who are we going to trust more? You know, are we going to trust a state-sanctioned censor, or are we going to trust artificial intelligence to do it? Or are we going to rely on tribes that may drive us into these factional groups? So clearly the structures of society are changing, and this is one view of it. Maybe organizations will become increasingly lightweight and reconfigurable, because our old organizations, built on mass and might and physical footprint, have spent 40 years of globalization and offshoring deliberately trying to disengineer that. And so our organizations are likely to be lightweight, reconfigurable, able to change on a dime. But we're also likely to see tribal structures and community structures becoming more visible and more permanent. So you may leave a job but remain connected to a tribe. We're likely to see the emergence of the guilds, especially we already see it in areas like cybersecurity. People, you know, go and work for HSBC or Barclays or NatWest, but really they belong to a guild of cybersecurity experts. And I've done work on this at the government level and with various militaries on it. You know, what does this mean? How do you train people to become to work in cyber defense? It's a skill which is learnt offensively. You know, if you put together a syllabus and train people in it, then it's just a book for what to avoid doing. So it's likely that expertise will be held in more clearly codified guilds. They may be formal structures that you pay membership fees to, or they may be social structures where you just have to conform to the right language. You know, maybe the way that you get into the Agile Guild is by being able to explain what the heck it means. You know, maybe they will be closed, gated communities of experience, but they are likely to become political, because as expertise flows somewhere, so too does political power. And hence, if you have political power, you also tend to become a financial entity, which is exactly what happened with the old guilds. You know, they became dominant financial structures of society. Education is clearly wide open to disruption. We're just at the verge of seeing the disruption as big tech eats up education, eats up finance, and then probably eats up healthcare, because people don't generally love the utility that those systems offer, and they love the experience that many of the new tech companies are able to offer. So something of this disruption is what we're likely to see, and hence the challenge we face in our formal roles as well as our social ones is, how will we evolve our own organizations. So let's just sort of throw it open just for comments, questions, ideas. I'm just reading, sorry, you said I've been rambling on. You should always stop me rambling.
No, definitely not rambling. I can help. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes, so I can probably just work through. We've had some really good sort of comments in here. I like this one at the end here. Indy's got a question here. Oh, it's still stuff coming in. How does competition sit within these social structures? Like, i.e. personal advancement over success for the org, or the guild or the local community, etc.
So, it's a really interesting one. I can't give you a good answer. I can just sort of indicate perhaps some of the forces that we see at play. That it's quite likely that our future modes of social organization perversely will be smaller but more interconnected. So I think what we've seen with the ramping up of population and globalization and industrialization and the rise of the transnationals and the metanationals are the rules of scale. So we've seen organizations scale up and hence build out mechanisms of control that match that. But what we're probably seeing in parallel, if we look back to that primary culture, is that what people generally want is to belong, to have a voice, to be valued. And so we're likely to see our social structures breaking down there. But that could be bad. So we're clearly seeing our political process fragmenting. And whether we can find the types of leadership and the types of social structure which can engage in difference rather than just engage with dissent will be quite central to it. And, you know, my own work at the moment is quite influenced by both political theory and economic theory, trying to understand how markets actually do harm to a lot of social systems, and understanding how popular modes of social organization need to be tempered by deliberative modes. So that's just kind of where my thinking is kicking around with this stuff at the moment.
Oh, that's good. Not a lot of other questions in here, just some nice little bits of banter between some of our audience. It's all good. Scott's gone all pirate as usual.
He'll find good company on this call.
Yeah, definitely. We've had a few good sessions on pirate type theme. So we had Tendai Vicky the other week doing, because he'd recently done Pirates in the Navy.
Excellent.
So that was a great session as well. Any other final thoughts or questions? We've got about 7 minutes. So.
Well, the question about you know, Eastern and Western models of social structure, you know, is interesting. And again, there's a lot of interesting work on this. I'm just reading a book at the moment by Nicholas Berg-Ruin on renovating democracy, which really looks exactly at this. So, I mean, predominantly his lens is the US and China. I think I would say we are likely to see something new emerging. So the things that we do see, especially in countries like Singapore, we see that social norms can evolve quite rapidly. So any sort of description of cultural traits determined by East versus West, or indeed by different countries, tend to be highly fluid. So they're stereotypes which are actually very fluid at a behavioral level. So normally I would say pretty much anyone in the world can go to work for, you know, JP Morgan, and 2 years later they typically exhibit many of the same cultural traits as everybody else that works for JP Morgan. You know, culture is a learned phenomena, not in entirely, but it's quite likely that at a human level we are quite fluid or adaptable in our behaviours. What may be interesting, or what I certainly think is interesting, is that future power is likely to be more negotiated. So one of the themes I've been following recently in a body of work I just published a couple of months ago called Finding Your Campfire, which looked at the impact of the pandemic and the move to remote. So there are 3 sections of the book. One looks at the individual journey, one looks at the leadership journey, and one looks at the cultural journey. But what I say in the 3rd section, I say when we fled the office, on day 1 of the lockdown, and we fled the office with our laptop under one arm and the pot plant in the other, and we left behind our desks and cafes, we left behind more than physical space and the crap on our desks. We left behind power. So power is intimately related to space. So as space becomes democratized and distributed, so too does power. So it's ever easier for social movements to form and move, and for people to connect, and for people to challenge. And there's a great leveling of power. So one of the core themes of the social age is a rebalancing of power between organization and individual. So it's almost certainly we will see that both future organizations and future cultures will tend to be successful if they are able to find ways to interconnect rather than to exist in conflict.
That's an interesting thought. Yep. No, it's good. I think we've got 4 minutes left, so I'm probably going to sort of bring it to a close there. Sure, we could probably keep talking for at least another hour. You've always got a lot of insightful stuff to say, Julian. I really appreciate you joining us this evening. Really enjoyed that. I think it was fabulous. Great participation from everyone.
If anybody wants,
that's just so everyone can see your sort of wide-ranging body of work there. Yeah, excellent. So
these books are all free as downloads, I should say. I'm not trying to sell anybody anything. If you're interested in any of those, they're all available free as ebooks.
So, just to say thanks again. Appreciate you joining us. Really enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody else enjoyed it just as much as I did. Always good to hear from you. So no, thank you. I'm unmuted, so I'll give you a round of applause. You sometimes we do the virtual applauses, but I'm unmuted. So no, thanks again, and looking forward to continuing on your program. It's proving to be a really worthwhile journey. So thanks again. Just a couple of community shout outs, just so you all know what's coming up. I'm sure you probably do if you're in meetup. So next couple of weeks, we've got speakers from further afield. So next week we've got Steve Wendell joining us from the US. He's got an amazing body of work as well. He's just recently published a book on behavioural change and what that looks like. Fascinating subject matter as well. So he's joining us from the States. So hopefully make that if that's of interest. And the week after that, we close the month with Karen Ferris, and she's joining us from Australia. And she'll be talking about how we build resilience in the workplace. So a couple of really fascinating sessions coming up for you, and then we'll look at a whole bunch of other stuff in August. So I'm sure you're aware. And I think that's it. I don't think I've missed anything. There's nothing from any other groups coming up that I can also shout out for, but I'm sure other things will come along. But thanks again for joining us. Awesome participation, really good, great questions, great thoughts. I've certainly been left with lots to think about. And look forward to seeing you all again soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening, afternoon, day, wherever you happen to be. Thanks again. See you soon, folks. Thank you.
Thanks.